Hello to all of Mr. Danner's United States history classes. I wanted to go ahead and just talk everybody through a couple of the assignments because I think there's been a lot of confusion from some people who are just struggling to know exactly what the expectation is and what to do. And it's kind of showing in the amount of work that's being done and turned in. And then to your guys' credit, there's a lot of questions. And so when I'm seeing some of the same questions, I want to make sure that I'm addressing them. So what this video is going to do, and I'm going to timestamp it below, but this video is going to walk through the protest unit. And I'm not going to go in depth on a lot of it, but I'm going to show you what the expectation is and walk you through some of the things that we did. And hopefully this will help some people who are really struggling to get this work done. So when I start this, all I'm going to ask is just really give this a look and take the time to get this stuff turned in. And then if you're still struggling, reach out to me personally, and I'm always here to help. So what you want to do, and I'm sharing my screen right now. You can see up here is all of our classwork. And the thing that you need to focus on is this Unit 1 2020 protests. That's all the classwork we need to do. And so there's 3 assignments. There's the anti-civil rights protest assignment. There was a Venn diagram in there to do. There's the civil rights protest assignment, another Venn diagram, and then there's writing a claim answering the question, is there anything new about the 2020 protests? So I'm going to just walk you through all 3 of those assignments very briefly, and then hopefully this will help some people who are struggling. So the purpose of the unit is to look at what's going on in the city, around the country, and then compare it to the history of protests in our country. And we want to know are these protests that are happening in our country anything new, or are they just more of a lot of the same protests that have occurred throughout our country's history? Because there's been a lot of talk and protest around the idea of getting equal rights for people, and sometimes about taking away rights from people. And so what we're going to look at, again, the whole unit is focused around this question: is there anything new about the 2020 protests? And so keep that in mind for everything you're doing. So what we're doing first, and this was a little bit more of a controversial thing that we looked at, but we're looking at similarities and differences between historic protests and modern protests whose goals were to take away people's civil rights. And so that's why this first set of protests were a little bit, like I said, a little bit controversial. So we're just going to spend a little bit of time on there, and I'm going to give you some examples, and then we're going to move on to a little bit more in depth about similarities and differences between protests where people are actually asking and demanding, not asking for, demanding civil rights and equal rights. So what we did was the first event of marches aimed to restrict or take away rights. We looked at 2 events. One was from 1925, and it was the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, marching in Washington, D.C., and they were trying to basically get people to join their movement and also trying to restrict immigration in our country based on race. That was the purpose of that march. It was again, trying to keep immigrants of certain races coming into our country. Again, a very controversial thing that would not be accepted today. And then there was the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. And this was, again, trying to encourage people to join this idea of white supremacy, which was people who are white saying that they are the superior race in the country. And they're trying to get people to buy into that idea. So again, these are things that there are people in our country who believe this. There are most who do not. And so I'm showing this just to show you that these are things that exist in our country. I am not trying to push an idea at all, I promise you. But we need to be aware that these things exist in our country. And so the first event was the KKK march in 1925. And all I'm asking you to do is look at these three pictures, 1, 2, and 3. That's going to be on slides 6, 7, and 8. And then compare to the images on slides 9, 10, and 11. And so, honestly, if you want to even simplify this further, I would say take slide 8, that's people marching, and compare that to slide 10 of people marching. And that's all. That's the big thing I'm gonna show you how to do is just compare this event to this event. And that's the purpose, is the Venn diagram is we're looking for similarities, which would go in the middle, and differences, which would go on the outside. And so I have some examples in here. I'm actually going to take those away. They're going to show up in your document, though. Actually, why would I take those away? As I'm thinking, I'm just going to leave those in there. So let's compare picture 8 to picture 10. So here's a group of people. They're all dressed the same. They're holding hands. They're marching in unison. And it looks very well organized. Whereas in this event, you see it looks a lot less organized. They're not dressed the same. Nobody's holding hands. There's no real lines or unison. They're just kind of walking. So one difference is that in the KKK march, people were holding hands, marching in unity, and it seems more organized. So that's one example of a difference. Because then on the other side, you say, well, and then the Unite the Right rally, people were marching, but they weren't holding hands. They weren't in line, and they seemed less organized. So that's a difference between the two events. So you can say that, these events are very different because of that, just based on that. Another thing you want to look at is that in the Unite the Right rally, there was something called a counter protest, which is these were people who were trying to stop the white supremacists or the white nationalists. They were trying to get the other message out. So the Unite the Right rally was all about these white nationalists saying that white people were superior. But there was a counter protest that was obviously disagreeing, saying that no, white people are not superior. We need to have equality. So shut down white supremacy. No KKK. Even in this march, there's this picture up here, this banner, diversity makes us stronger. That was a counter protest. Whereas here, there was no counter protest. People just kind of let this happen and watched it happen. And so I have this here. There was no counter protest in the KKK march. There was in the Unite the Right rally. So that's another difference. And then finally, a similarity is that they were all trying to get people to join their cause. That's just one similarity among others. Another similarity can just be they did march through cities. That's a similarity. That people were waving flags to show their pride. So those are some similarities. What I need people to do, though, is add to this. One thing that a lot of people were doing was just turning this in because my examples were here. I need people to add to these. Find just 2 or 3 more similarities or 2 or 3 more differences. And post that, then turn this document in. So that's looking at the anti-civil rights marches. And I spent a little bit more time on that than I wanted. But then the next set is we're looking at these civil rights marches. And this is going to be where you're going to find a lot more similarities and differences. What are similarities and differences between historic and modern protests demanding civil rights? These are the people, like what's going on in Louisville, is people asking for the truth and for equality and for equal treatment based on race. And that's been an issue in our country for its entire existence. And so what you're doing here is very similar to the type of thinking that we were doing in the first lesson. But here we're looking at people who are actually demanding civil rights and equality. And so here's just a group of pictures from this summer in the 2020 protests all around the country. Lots of people marching. They are in St. Louis, doing a die-in in Boston. This is the front line of the protests in Washington, D.C. This is a major protest around a Confederate general statue in Virginia. And so you're taking this event and you're comparing this to all of these historic events, which are the ones in color on all of my slides. So you're taking all of these events on the colored slides and comparing them to this first event. And if you want, you can even look up more pictures from what's going on in our country now, even in our city. You can look up pictures from yesterday about the protests in Louisville and use them. But what you're doing is comparing this event, the protests that are going on right now in our country, to all of these historic protests. And it's the same type of thinking. What's similar? What's different? So we're looking at this silent parade through New York City. This was people marching in silence all through New York City. And they were fighting against violence against African Americans. So that's one similarity you can put right there. Because you see, we're talking they're protesting against brutal riots and violence. It's called recent killings of Black people in race riots. So there's a similarity between historic and current protests. And if you want to add to here, you just add insert text box. Protests often are against violence to African Americans. Protests are often fighting against, not fighting, protesting against. So that's a similarity. And you would put that right in the middle. I'll tell you right now, this is a march. This is thousands of people marching through New York City. You have the Selma to Montgomery March. This was people during the Civil Rights Movement marching from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, which was about 50 miles. It was not a short walk. It was about 50 miles. It took them a couple of days. And they were fighting for voting rights, but they were marching. Here's the Million Man March. Again, this was in 1995, and it was, again, equal rights for all races. There was a march involved there. So another similarity is, and even now, there's always like organized marches and walks through the streets where people are just showing their unity. Many or all protests include unified marches. That's another similarity. Now, we can look for some differences. A lot of the time, I'll tell you right now, this was a very peaceful march. The Selma March was very peaceful, except for one incident that turned violent. But you have to judge, do you think an event is violent just because one violent instance occurred? Or was it because the rest of it was peaceful? Does that make it peaceful? Just like the current protests. Yeah, violence has happened. But I would say that there's been a lot more, for every one day of violence that happens in these protests, there's probably 20 or 30 days of nonviolence. Um, but that's just something to think about as well, is that, in the 2020 protests, you can put that, and that can be a similarity as well, honestly. Text box. Violence occurs, but rarely. And then differences. I mean, look at the 2020 protests. You could say, I mean, one thing about the 2020 protests is, look, Virginia, Washington, D.C., Massachusetts, St. Louis, all over the world. Here, New York City. It was all taking place in one city. Selma to Montgomery was just kind of an isolated event. Some in Alabama. The Million Man March in Washington, D.C. The Ferguson protests, yeah, the protests took place in other parts of the country around this, but most of the stuff was going on in Missouri. So one thing about the 2020 protests, happening around the world. You can see you will see Breonna Taylor's name in cities around the world because of people protesting for the same causes. Whereas most, I'm not going to say not all, most, but not all historic protests happen in one place or are isolated. And I'll tell you, a lot of that is because of the news and social media. As social media and news becomes much more prominent, you're going to see events tend to go much further around the world. So that's the expectation for those two assignments. Now, I know I've gotten very long on this video already. And like I said, I'll put timestamps so you can know where to go for question 1, question 2. But the last thing we're going to do is there anything new about the 2020 protests? So what you're going to do is you're going to look at your Venn diagrams that include different stuff than what I posted and make sure differences go on the outside, similarities go in the middle. Differences go on the outside, similarities go in the middle. So if I'm saying, is there anything new about the 2020 protests? Are there more things different or new? Or are there more things that are the same? And that's up to you to decide. So here, I'm just asking, what are 3 similarities that you put between historic protests and the 2020 protests? So take some similarities, take some stuff from the middle. What are 3 similarities? Marches. Marches always seem to occur no matter when the protests happen. What are 3 differences? Again, historic tend to be in one city or very few, while the 2020 protests are happening around the world. And you can even talk about when they occurred, because these 2020 protests have been going on for a long time. The dates of those historic protests were, 1 or 2 days. Now, I'm not saying that the movement died. I mean, the civil rights movement lasted years, but the protests within the civil rights movement um, only would last a day or two. Of course, in the future, the 2020 protests may end up being a whole movement because they are so large in scope. All right, so based on the work you did, are there more similarities or more differences? Let me know. Are there more similarities or differences? That's up to you. And so now, do you think, is there anything new about the 2020 protests? Yes or no? Are these protests similar to every protest that ever happened? Is it just more of the same? Or is this something new, something different? Let me know. And then tell me why. Why is there something new about these protests? What's new about these protests? Or no, they're not new. So what? Why aren't they new? What's the same as the other protests? That's what 3 reasons go there. And then finally, your claim. This can be a sentence or two, and you're just answering this question in a full claim. Is there anything new about the 2020 protests? Now, you can write this on your own. I've seen good claims that have been 1 or 2 sentences. I've seen them get to be about 4 or 5 sentences. If you're struggling, here's some sentence starters. Let's say that you say there is nothing new about the 2020 protests, and you don't know how to start that. Well, here you go. Here's a sentence starter. Copy it, paste it up here. There's nothing new about the 2020 protests. They are just like historic protests because, and give me the 3 reasons, but just explain those reasons. 2 and 3. Because marches always seem to occur because whatever, and because whatever. I'm not going to give you the answers. This is your writing. But you can use these sentence starters. Over time, I hope that you're not going to use them, but for now, I'm happy to let you use them. So that's the entire unit. And sorry, like I said, this video got a bit long, but I want to be sure that everyone knows how to do these assignments because there's people struggling. And I know being in the live classes is hard sometimes, so I want to make sure that these videos are here to walk you through this whole process. So if you need any help, always reach out to me individually. Please, I am here to help. I want to make sure everyone does well. And the level of support that we give is going to look totally different in NTI versus in-person class. So let me know what that support needs to look like for you, because that's what I want to do. I want to be there to support you. So just let me know. I'm here to help, and thanks for watching.